We do it normally.
Hello and welcome to Tiski Sour. I'm Michael Walker. Aaron Bastani is back.
How you doing?
I'm very well. How are you?
Good. Had a busy week. Exerted myself taking on the Labour right machine in Lewisham East.
Yep.
We fell short, but we gave it a good go.
Any? What's your analysis?
The lady who's won, Janet Dabby, she voted twice for Jeremy Corbyn. She has adopted 2 children. She started a food bank. She's a black lady. She's exactly who you want as an MP. 5 years ago, she would have been seen on the far left of the Labour Party. Now the Labour right is crowing about how this is a victory for moderates. So, in a way, it shows how much has changed. She got 280 votes. My view was that her ceiling was maybe 300. If Sakina Sheikh, who I was working for, had a bit more time, I think she would have won it. But we simply didn't have enough time. She got 135 votes over the course of a week. If we had a month, I think Sakina would have won it on a very radical programme. But congratulations to Janet. She'll be a great MP.
Yeah, the mobilisation was quite impressive. I thought lots of people were out in a 7-day campaign. I'm also joined by Lowkey. Pleasure to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah. How was your weekend?
It was good. It was nice.
Did you go for the FA Cup or the royal wedding?
I mean, definitely the royal wedding, of course. I mean, where else would I be?
Did you watch it?
No, I didn't. I mean, I saw bits and pieces, but, you know, I am a Republican, so it turned the stomach in some ways.
Yeah. Well, the royal wedding, that's what we're going to talk about now. Because it was a big moment for the royals, I think. Prince Harry married Meghan Markle. It was billed very heavily as the royal family becoming inclusive and entering the 21st century. Meghan Markle, Harry's bride, is divorced, of dual heritage and a successful actress, although she had to give that up to become princess. The wedding itself included a sermon delivered by an African-American pastor who mentioned Martin Luther King and slavery. Drab English hymns were replaced with Stand By Me. Aaron and Lowkey, either of you. Does this wedding show Britain and the British establishment have become more inclusive and less chauvinistic? Have the royals become woke? I'm going to go to you.
There's a great quote in the Il Gattopardo, the leopard, and Prince Tancredi, who's the son of an aristocrat, and he says, because there's a revolution, Italy's about to be unified, this is the old sort of Sicilian Neapolitan aristocracy, and he says, "Father, everything has to change for everything to stay the same." And that's what we saw this weekend. There's also a similar quote by Lord Macaulay in this country in the 1830s, preceding the Great Reform Act. He said, "Reforms that you may preserve," which is kind of like the strapline of British conservatism. And hats off, they've done pretty well. They're still going. We've still got a royal family. Not many countries can say that. And I think this is a totem as to why we have such a successful aristocratic establishment, not even an industrial bourgeoisie, a hangover from feudalism, because they have been strategic enough to do things like what we saw this weekend, which is bring in just enough change at just the right moment to maintain order, but also a semblance of being in touch with the rest of society, when the reality is they're anything but.
Yeah, I concur.
The thing that surprised me was how totally everyone bought it. So I was watching the BBC, the coverage. I actually watched the highlights because I was out in the day, and it's very long, isn't it? But the commentary was so uncritical, and they had to pretend to be so serious. They kept looking at Meghan Markle's mum and saying, she must be so proud that her daughter's marrying into royalty. It's like, really? Is that a given? That, you know, she was a successful actress. She's given up her acting career to become a professional wife. It seems all a bit bizarre.
What I find interesting is the way that certain immigrations are deemed invisible. So if we look at Prince Philip, we know that this was someone who was born in Corfu, Prince of Greece. Okay, we look at Queen Charlotte, for example. She was of mixed heritage. We look at the history of the royal family. We know it's largely rooted in the Norman invasion of 1066. There is this, they changed their name to Windsor in the First World War. So there is this extent to which their immigration is generally perceived to be kind of this non-immigration, as it were. But then somebody like Meghan Markle, you know, you look at Marks and Spencer's, they renamed themselves, I think, just for 2 days, something like Markle and Sparkles or something. But Marks and Spencer's in and of itself, you know, that bastion of Englishness was the product of immigrants, people that came to this country escaping persecution in Eastern Europe, you know, in the 30s. So I think that there is a hybridity to what we even understand to be Britishness, which in many ways is camouflaged, you know, in certain things. So it's interesting.
I think that comparison to how the royals have often married people of different ethnicities or from different countries is interesting, because you look at the two marriages that have happened in the last 10 years and they have saved the royal family. I think Will and Kate sort of saved the idea of the dynasty. You had Charles, who had a sort of controversial marriage with Diana, love letters about tampons. No one was really looking forward to having this couple as sort of like the image of Britain, and then Will and Kate come along as the perfect, conventional, good-looking couple. I mean, Will's not that good-looking, but Kate's good-looking. Then this time around with Harry and Meghan, it's made the royal family seem woke. You know, it's just as before a prince would marry their cousin from Austria or Spain to form some kind of alliance, Harry's married someone American of mixed heritage, and that suddenly made the royal family seem like this real global phenomenon that's outward looking. And I'm sort of interested in the way that, not to be cynical, but obviously those marriages 200 years ago were explicitly organised. You were explicitly told you should marry your cousin from Germany so that we can create this...
Consolidate power.
We can consolidate this alliance. And I don't know, do you think that when the royal kids go dating, they have to sort of discuss with the royal PR guys whether or not it works for the firm?
I imagine so. I'd be surprised if not. But one thing about Prince Harry that I think we should remember, especially at this stage when he's being largely put forth as this lover of equality, shall we say, when he was in the British Army in Afghanistan, he was, recorded referring to the people he was fighting as ragheads. He filmed himself referring to somebody else in the British Army as our Paki friend. He's had parties, wearing swastikas and whatnot. So, presenting him as this kind of equal opportunities, amazing person is really not the case.
Aaron?
Yeah, I think Prince William probably could only marry a certain strata of society because it's obviously the heir to the throne. I think there's a lower threshold generally with William. I mean, at the end of the day, he's massively overreached. Meghan Markle's beautiful. She is very talented and accomplished in her own right. I mean, I would disagree about Kate. I'm not going to, attack what anybody looks like. Meghan Markle's a lot more attractive.
Yeah.
She's a lot more got a lot more glamour and that kind of vibe to her. And I think, Kate was chosen precisely because she wasn't Diana, in a sense, very reliable, no farting about. And I think different rules apply with Harry. But the woke thing is bizarre because the royal family, by virtue of what it is not an inclusive institution. It is based upon inheritance. It's based upon who your parents are. That is the opposite of being inclusive. The idea that all people are made equal in the eyes of God is a revolutionary idea, as was said by the pastor during the wedding. That doesn't apply to kings and queens.
That's right.
We're not all born equal for them. Some are better than others.
That's right.
And I think what you're talking about, how Harry's history really doesn't show he's particularly woke in terms of calling people ragheads, and that hasn't featured at all in the media coverage, sort of shows how willing all different parts of the British establishment are to save the monarchy. Everyone's really into this new vision of the woke monarchy.
Yeah. And also they have to constantly peddle this idea that the royal family brings in tourism, but France gets a lot more tourism than Britain, and we know what happened to Marie Antoinette in the French Revolution.
Well, I was talking to, in terms of what they bring to the country, I was talking to a journalist who does a lot of work on the civil service yesterday, and he was saying he thinks that the role of the royals is going to get really beefed up in post-Brexit Britain, partly to secure trade deals. So if you think at the moment we haven't had, the head of state hasn't really mattered in terms of sort of like going abroad and bringing in trade because we were part of the EU, which made our trade deals. But if you connect sort of like this very international wedding, where this was a much bigger deal in America than any previous royal wedding has been because there was an American bride. If you look at a couple of years ago when that Tory MP was saying we need to invest millions of pounds in a new royal yacht where trade can take place. And this
what's it called again? They had a really batshit name for it.
Yacht face?
No. Anyway, I'll come. Yeah,
we'll look it up.
I'll remember.
This journalist was also telling me yesterday that there was an interesting move by a top civil servant, so a guy called Simon Case, who looked like maybe he was going to be the next top dog in the civil service. He was currently in one of the deputy positions in DEXU, the department for leaving the EU. He'd been the private secretary to Theresa May and David Cameron, and he's just made a career move which would normally look like a downgrade. He's become the secretary to Prince Charles, which would normally be a sort of politically irrelevant job. So if you're ambitious and you want loads of power, the last thing you should do is leave the top of the civil service to become a helper to the prince. But this guy was saying maybe this is a sign that it is going to become a more beefed up, important political institution, the monarchy, to go abroad and make deals with Donald Trump, especially if democracy is receding around the world. Are the royals back? Is feudalism back?
Well, I mean, you look at
Hey, but it's woke.
Yeah, woke feudalism.
We've got mixed heritage feudalism, so it's okay.
But like, you know, you look at Prince Andrew, you look at Prince Charles, they have played quite important roles for BAE Systems. For example, you know, you look at the way that the Queen received the Chinese president when he came. You know, I think that is a kind of historic role for them and function for them, but it would be interesting to see how it changes kind of in the post-Brexit Britain.
We've got a few comments here saying, can't we just go back to ignoring them? Why are you talking about this? There's a broader conversation about this, and it sort of impedes the discussion around republicanism in this country, because people say, well, it's just, okay, it's a couple of 100 million, grand scheme of things, it's not much, purely a symbolic head of state. But the reality is, they are the key component in a sort of edifice of power and illegitimate authority in this country. And without them, the whole facade collapses. The Duchy of Cornwall, large swathes of London, many of the most powerful people in this country, the Duke of Westminster, until very recently the wealthiest man in the country, effectively, you know, he's inherited that from his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather in 1066, as you said. Norman aristocracy, effectively. If we're going to talk about a different kind of country, different kind of economy, land reform, real democracy, then we have to talk about the monarchy, and we have to talk about how Britain becomes a republic. And the reality is, right now, they're very popular. So it needs to be a strategic set of questions we need to ask ourselves. And what's interesting is, there's something called, have you heard of this, Operation London Bridge?
No.
Oh, that's what happens when the Queen dies, right?
When the Queen dies, there is a plan shared by the Civil Service, MI5, MI6, all the major papers, big business, Operation London Bridge, and it's how they're going to cover her death for the week afterwards, because they know that once she goes, I mean, look, she's been the monarch since the early 1950s. There will be a huge opportunity to discuss constitutional change in this country. In a way, it'll be bigger than Brexit almost. And I think it's something at Navarra I want us to really do, is to grab the opportunity when it comes. Obviously, I want her to, as a human being, I want her to live a long and happy life. I mean, she already has, to be quite frank. But when she passes away of natural causes, of course, it's our right to have a conversation about what kind of country we want to be.
I think if the Queen had died in 2000 and we'd had a less deferential Prime Minister than Tony Blair, we wouldn't have a royal family anymore. Because that was like, you know, they were so unpopular at that point, and especially Charles. People, like, it was quite a popular theory in the national press that the Queen had murdered Diana, the most popular person in Britain. So the idea that
But it was largely suppressed as well, though. I mean, Keith Allen's documentary was banned and stuff like that.
I mean, I think there's a question mark hanging over what happened in that bridge.
We should get Sean on for this one, shouldn't we? She'd love that. I mean, that'll probably get better traffic than all the rest of our shows put together. Who killed Diana?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about it on Navarro FM before. I don't think it's a completely outlandish theory.
Of course, it's not.
But anyway, they've
of course, a relative of the King of England being a Muslim, really? Come on, they're not that woke.
Have you seen the documentary by Keith Allen?
No.
It's pretty good.
Is that one to YouTube?
I don't think it's even on YouTube, because it was banned in this country, as far as I understand.
Wow.
You couldn't access it on the net. But it's interesting, yeah.
You have to like illegally torrent it in like a Starbucks or something.
I mean, one last thing I wanted to mention on the royal wedding was the idea that it was, I think lots of people, even the Observer had 7 pages of fawning about the royal wedding. The dress was, there was a headline which was, it was the dress suited for a feminist. And even Afua Hirsch, who's normally very critical of sort of like traditional imperial establishments, had said that this wedding showed that the British establishment was opening up and celebrating black culture. And what it reminded me of, in a way, and obviously there's a big criticism, like this is an imperial establishment, but people say, oh, it's the symbolism. It's important that when people look at the royal family, they see themselves reflected in it, and the comparison is with Obama. But the difference with this is Obama had got elected by a majority of the American people. Like, whether or not he was a neoliberal, that said something significant about race in America.
Yeah.
The fact that a majority of the country had consented to have a president by a big margin whose middle name was Hussein and whose surname sounded a bit like Osama. You know, like that was a big deal in terms of symbolism. But to pretend the fact that Prince Harry fell in love with someone who was mixed race and that says something huge about British society, it just seems really odd that everyone sort of like accepted that as a given.
And what about, I mean, the big question is his hair. No wax in his hair? He looked a mess.
Yeah, he did look a mess,
He looked a
didn't he?
mess, right? So
Yeah, he
maybe
looked wild scruffy.
Maybe he's like, he'd had a bit of an, like, you know, been on the piss the night before, or God knows what he did the night before, right?
Surely they don't.
Given his track record.
Surely they don't let him. Yeah.
I'm being serious. He looked terrible.
That's why people like him, though. Because he's more popular than the Queen. He's more popular than Will. He's way more popular than Charles.
It was like, because he was the fourth most popular guy in Britain. Corbyn was fifth, right?
And that's because people have seen him naked on Twitter and they think sort of, you know, they can relate to that. Less dry than the other ones.
And he flew on...
Maybe there was a PR guy that told him not to sort of neaten up his hair. Said, like, the thing you've got is that you look kind of struff. Oh, wow, that's Photoshop. Come on, he's not that. If you're
that's
listening,
obviously Photoshopped.
That's Photoshopped, yeah. That's not actually Prince Harry naked.
That's Prince Harry on Michael's body.
Oh, thanks, Aaron. All right. Any last thoughts on the Royals? No?
Get rid of him.
Get rid of him?
That's it.
But to be honest, would you, if you could choose, would Corbyn say tomorrow, I'm a Republican, let's get rid of the Royals?
No, I think McDonald's line is, I'm a Republican, most people aren't, and just own your republicanism.
Yeah,
I'm going to own my republicanism.
All right, we're moving on from the Royals. Today was day one of the Grenfell enquiry, which aims to come to a conclusion about what caused the disaster around this time last year. Lowkey, you're a perfect person to have on the show today because you're around the area. You're from there. You've been involved in the Justice for Grenfell campaign. I'll be asking your thoughts on the inquiry in Grenfell a year on. But before I do that, we're going to show a clip of your music video, Ghosts of Grenfell. Can we get that up now?
The night our eyes changed. Rooms where love was made and unmade in a flash of the night. Rooms where memories drowned in fumes of poison. Rooms where futures were planned and the imagination of children built castles in the sky. Rooms where both the extraordinary and the mundane were lived, become forever tortured graves of ash. Oh, you political class, so servile to corporate power.
The day that you're us, the day that you're us, the day that you're
Ghosts of Grenfell still calling for justice, now hear 'em scream.
the day that you're us, the day that you're us, the day that
This corporate manslaughter will haunt you, now hear 'em scream. Words cannot express, please allow me to begin though. 1:30 a.m, heard the shouting from my window. People crying in the street, watching the burning of their kinfolk. Grenfell Tower now,
So you were there when it happened. You saw the fire, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe before we go on to the inquiry, just talk a bit about sort of like your memories of that time, of that sort of...
Well, it was apocalyptic. You know, we had some inkling of how the state could disappear and how, you know, the otherwise invisible infrastructure could malfunction. But we'd never really seen something quite that extraordinary. You know, you're talking about the equivalent of 30,000 litres of petrol on the side of the building. So the way in which it went up and knowing there were people you knew in the building as well, seeing people calling from the windows, seeing, you know, a specific family that 3 generations of them died in there, and seeing them basically begging for help from the window, seeing a helicopter come, and, you know, us thinking, you know, kind of naive ignorance that through some kind of act of divine intervention, maybe this helicopter was going to rescue the people from the window. And then seeing the helicopter turn around was really excruciating process. So, yeah, I mean, it was like the end of the world, how you would imagine it to be, I guess. Very apocalyptic indeed.
And to what extent do you feel like the community is recovered?
I mean, in many ways, the idea of community was born really on that day. Obviously, there were institutions that have been worn away by a kind of attritional austerity in the area, and there have been many consequences of that wearing away of those functions but moreover, you found that in these situations where the state disappears, you saw it in Katrina, people create different ways to administer the things that traditionally the state would administer, whether it's sustenance, whether it's shelter, and you saw people doing that, and I think that was exceptional. But moreover, you have a greater cognizance of interest, within the area, because what preceded Grenfell was the Save Silchester campaign. I think it's important people know that. Because within the Save Silchester campaign, the idea had been that Grenfell would be safe from the refurbishment, but all the rest of the blocks would not be, because Grenfell had already had the refurbishment. It would be safe from the regeneration, because for that reason they couldn't knock down Grenfell, but all the rest of the blocks were fair game. So we were campaigning really against that. But then obviously when Grenfell happened, you had all these concessions of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, whether, before that they wanted to sell off the library, they backed off on the library, they went ahead and had sold off the youth centre, which was really an important part of it. They conceded on the stables, and like I say, they conceded on the rest of the blocks in the area.
So you're saying this was already a community that was sort of involved in struggle with the council?
It was definitely, but of course with nowhere near the same level of urgency and no real knowledge of what the cost of inaction could be. Because the stakes were never as high as they have been. Grenfell has to be a never again moment.
So to move on to the inquiry which started today, it starts at the moment with families of the bereaved sort of giving evidence or giving sort of the story of the people that died in the tower. It's going to move on to, in phase 1, talk about the proximate causes of the fire. So it's going to talk about what happened on that night, how the fire started, how it spread. And then in phase 2, it's going to talk about some of the more political causes, although I think that's still limited to the local area. So it's going to talk about, or it's going to find out about or look into the complaints that were made by people in that community and how the council responded and what liability the council might have. The fact that the inquiry has that second part is itself a victory of the community, because I think the judge who was appointed to oversee the inquest at first said, look, I think he said quite explicitly to the community, look, this isn't going to cover all the things you want it to cover. It's basically just going to cover why the fire started that night and why it spread. And with a petition that got 156,000 signatures, partly because it got shared by Stormzy, the government gave in, and there's now going to be one of phase 2, which is going to talk about the proximate political causes. And also the panel, which presides over the inquest, is now going to have 2 independent experts who are supposedly going to have some connection to the community, although we don't know who they are yet. Given all this, how confident are you that the inquest will come up with something that looks like justice?
Well, I think a really important part of this is Dave Collins, who was the chair of the Grenfell Residents Association during the refurbishment. He hasn't got core participant status, and I think that's really not good. As far as I understand, the inquiry only has access to around 270,000 documents, and the police, for their investigation, have access to 31 million documents. So there's a big difference in the scope. I think what needs to be looked at, and I'm not sure if it will be, I hope it will be, is the extent to which regulatory bodies were penetrated by captains of industry. How it was that you allowed companies like Celotex with RS 5000 insulation to basically go to BRE and test it themselves, misdescribe the test, and have it pass limited combustibility, supposedly.
So Celotex, they're the company that made the cladding?
Made the insulation. They made
the insulation.
The cladding was made by a US construction company called Arconic, and it had 6 millimeters of polyethylene in the middle of it. And, this is a US construction company, Arconic, but Celotex is a subsidiary of Saint-Gobain, which is a massive French construction company. Any inquiry worth its salt, or any investigation worth its salt, is going to bring the government into direct collision with the interests of these construction companies, who are backed up by the lobbyists specifically for the insulation, because after the Kyoto agreements, it was a big payoff for the insulation companies, because the government came out of that wanting to lower carbon emissions. One of the best ways to do it was to put insulation on a lot of the buildings. But the other point is that this same stuff that was used in the insulation, the same materials, is actually banned in furniture because of fires that happened. And eventually in the 80s, they passed regulation to ban its use in furniture. So it can somehow not be okay for you to have it in the seat you're sat on, but it could be okay for you to have it in the wall that's behind you. Doesn't really make sense. Moreover, we have to look at the situation where it's not only 300 buildings across the country that are administered, as part of social housing that have it on. There's untold amount of private blocks. Leaseholders in Croydon were told they had to pay £30,000 to get it removed. Leaseholders in Capital Key and Greenwich were told they had to pay £40,000 each to get it removed. You have it on hotels, you have it on schools, you have it on hospitals. This is a systemic problem that really needs and should have been addressed. The only reason 11 months after the fact that Theresa May agreed to put out £400 million to get it taken off is because of the absolutely heroic campaign which has been led by Justice for Grenfell, by Grenfell United firstly, Justice for Grenfell, and Humanity for Grenfell, and other groups, and of course Stormzy doing what he's done. But the point is that in the immediate aftermath, Sajid Javid said he wouldn't release the funds to local councils to get that stuff removed. So this has been a hard fought victory, and that has to be remembered. And that when people are campaigning for Grenfell, they're not just campaigning for this small corner of North Kensington. They're not. They're campaigning for all of us. They're campaigning for the children that are sleeping in hospitals in death traps, And not only did you have, after Lacanau fire, them come out and say, look, you should address the issue of cladding, but you should also look at putting in sprinklers in these kind of buildings, and they didn't do it in Grenfell, because something like 130 grand for them to do it. Obviously there's been a lot of press around how, some press around how Meghan Markle's dress was, worth 4 or 5 times that. This is so many. It's really essentially what caused Grenfell was a confluence of 3 issues that are really the basis of neoliberalism. So there's re-regulation in the interests of capital at the expense of human life. And so we see that in not only Thatcher taking what were 300 pages plus of building regulations and replacing them with around 24 pages of building regulations, but we also see it in Prescott in 2003, approved document B. The alterations that were made then allowed combustible cladding to be fitted for buildings. You also see local government basically converted into conduits of corporate power. So while national government may be a facilitator of corporate power, local government, and with the example of Kensington and Chelsea is a perfect example. You have them today coming out with £220 million property portfolio, private property portfolio for Kensington and Chelsea. There is legislation set in place that when a construction company is building a new complex in an area, they can escape the obligation for affordable housing within that new complex by paying a fee to the local government. Now, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, according to New York Times, received £33.4 million in these types of payments in September 2016. The deputy leader of RBKC, Rockfield Mellon, who actually was responsible for the change from a fire-resistant zinc cladding to the cladding that was used, and that actually violated EU procurement rules, because if you were going to make that change, you should have given the other companies the opportunity to bid for it, which he didn't do. He just went ahead and made that change against the wishes of the community.
Was that legal or?
Well, as far as I'm not a lawyer, but as far as I understand, it was against EU procurement rules, because if you make a change like that upon something that had been agreed upon by the community, they had said, we are happy with this fire-resistant zinc cladding, and then he made the change because it was, we want good prices for Rockfield and Mellon. That was what the email said. And they went ahead and changed it to the Arconic polyethylene, 6 millimeters of polyethylene cladding. So, that's the second of these 3 issues. The third issue is, of course, austerity, a situation where you've got 1,000 jobs in the fire service cut, you've got £100 million cut from the fire service, you've got something like 10 fire stations closed down, 29 fire engines out of use. When fire deaths were up by 20%, you had fire funding in the borough cut by 50%. So you're in a situation where not only when the fire brigade came, were they blocked off from 3 sides of the building by the refurbishment and by the building of the school, which the Grenfell Action Group had warned would make things disastrous in the instance of a fire. They had to bring in a ladder from Surrey in order for them to get halfway up the building. They went in with walkie-talkies that didn't work. And then on top of that, which is also indicative of what you have in other buildings that have this poisonous cladding and insulation in, they had a stay put policy. This is absolutely disastrous. People were told to stay in their homes. But the fact is those three main issues, I feel, were, it's a confluence of those three issues that caused Grenfell.
It's actually remarkable how little has changed with reference to any of those three issues.
Precisely.
Right? I mean,
you think that immediately there'd be any self-respecting government would change it.
Yeah, we talked about it a lot on Navarro at the time about how this did show the failure of neoliberalism to keep anyone safe.
Yep.
So basically what the reforms under Thatcher and New Labour did was mean that the fire brigade were no longer in charge of checking buildings to see if they were fire safe. You left that to the companies who built them. It was up to the companies who built a firm to get it signed off by a contractor as to whether it was safe. Self-regulation is really one of the things that made the fire at Grenfell possible and so disastrous. And I don't think we've really had much of a public discussion about changing that. And I think you're right that there's a big worry that won't be included in the inquiry, because I think so far they've said they're going to look at the events of the night, they're going to look at sort of like the local decisions to contract it. So that guy, what's his name? He's got a weird name.
Rockfield Mellon and Nick Paget-Brown. But Rockfield Mellon also, moonlighted as a property developer, and they were being wined and dined by property developers, and that's not kind of exceptional. That's something that we see in the councils all over London.
There was a piece ahead of I think it was a day or two before the local elections. Remember we brought it up? 100 London councillors are also involved in the property development industry, most of whom they work in the communications side. So they're in the public relations, the propaganda for the property industry, whilst purporting to be democratic representatives at a local level. I have to emphasise they aren't obviously working on there's no conflict of interest, but clearly because they're not doing those jobs in the same places where they'll be councillors. But
they're supposed to recuse themselves if it's a decision that they've got a vested interest in.
But the dynamic is pretty obvious. And a great example is a guy called Peter Bingle in Wandsworth. Now, Peter Bingle, this cliche we heard ahead of the local elections, everybody was saying Wandsworth was Thatcher's favourite council. Why was that? Because they had a very militant neoliberal council from the early 80s onwards, and they just wanted to do right to buy. They were sort of like the prototype for right to buy, wanted to privatise as much social housing as possible. Peter Bingle explicitly said, we need to sell lots of these social rents and council homes. We need to sell them as quickly as possible to turn Battersea into a Conservative constituency. This was social engineering to create a Conservative parliamentary seat. He explicitly said that. This gentleman was on Twitter. He's since left Twitter for Islamophobic abuse. I mean, it's kind of like a ground zero of like being a real arsehole. And yeah, his job was to just be wined and dined by the construction industry, by property developers, and he would get things done. And get things done just means effectively naked corruption, really shitting as much as possible on the poorest people in the city in order for the most powerful to make even more money and with less accountability. So we have a problem.
We wonder why we're in a situation where there's 1.2 million people on the waiting list for social housing in this country, while according to Shelter there's 300,000 people homeless, there's 1 in 59 people in the capital that are homeless. And it also, in terms of, just to take it back to the insulation, in terms of this penetration of regulatory bodies by captains of industry, you had Celotex putting on their website in 2011, Rob Warren, an employee of Celotex, putting up a post that said, quote unquote, Celotex enters government. We are now shaping building regulations to maximize benefits to our industry. You had Sajid Javid, when he was the Minister for Housing and Planning, he had an advisor on building regulations. That's the technical director of Celotex, Mark Allen. So you see this kind of incestuous relationship, which leads to really dire consequences when people die.
It's what Colin Crouch says about neoliberalism. So the idea, sort of like the official ideology, is that you'll get more competition and you'll get more efficiency as companies have to compete to build, like, do the work of a council, basically do the work of government. But what you actually get is just the infection of government with corporations who don't actually compete with anyone. They're there and they can affect the regulations that then control what they're able to build and at what cost. and they benefit at the expense of everyone else.
And also this incestuous relationship was illustrated by KPMG, who they did the accounts for Ryden, they did the accounts for Celotex, they did the accounts for RBKC, and for some reason they were employed by the inquiry and worked on it for 2 months. But then it came time to renew the contract, and thanks to a really fantastic campaign waged online and letter written and signed by many academics, KPMG eventually pulled out. But it permeates through so many different sections of this situation, these kind of incestuous relationships.
Yeah, I mean, a good example, KPMG is one of these companies which, obviously the first sort of months of the Corbyn leadership, everybody's going, oh, it's a shambles, there's no competence, yada, yada, yada. One of the major reasons why around the leadership the first time around between 2015 and 2016 was because they simply didn't have the staff. Part of the explanation for that was that funding was being starved from party headquarters. The other part was that previously people like Chuck Ruminer, Chris Leslie, Ed Balls had dozens of people seconded from KPMG, from McKinsey, from PricewaterhouseCoopers, and and then they would say, "Oh, these are the nice ones. These are the progressive ones." And you go, "Well, they're coming to work for you. They're giving you these guys for free for a reason. It's because you'll pass legislation that's in their favour. They're utility maximisers. On the one hand, you believe in sort of neoclassical economics, rational, calculative, utility maximisation. On the other hand, you think some of the most powerful vested interests in the world are going to give you people who help you produce socialist policy. I mean, it's this absolute grotesque idiocy of these people, of these politicians. They're not politicians. They're sort of this managerial apparatus at the top of neoliberalism. But I mean, that's how bad it was. I think Chuck Ruminer's office had 4 or 5 guys from, I think it was from Deloitte or KPMG.
Well, the ideology is what's good for business is good for society, right? That's how they'd justify that. But then obviously it's stupid. I mean, there's loads of vested interests that mean evidently that if you let businesses design regulation, that's going to be at the expense of a population safety of human life.
And the other part of it, of course, is the desktop studies, because we know that after the Garnock fire in Scotland, they don't allow these kind of desktop studies, but you have this cladding and the insulation, and rather than testing them each together in one test to see how flammable they'll be, what they did is they took the test results from the cladding and then they took the test results from the insulation, which of course when BRE was privatized in 97, that led to a situation where they kind of even outsourced the testing to the companies themselves. So Celotex comes to BRE and are able to describe their own tests. And rather than you taking the insulation and the cladding and testing them together to see how flammable they actually may be, you just put together the results from each of them on a desktop. And so the Hackett Review recently basically said, look, we won't do away with the desktop studies, but we know that Kingspan, insulation company, were actually lobbying to keep in desktop studies.
So they've already said that. The government have been explicit that they're not going to get rid of desktop
studies.
Well,
the Hackett Review said that. That they're not going to get rid of desktop studies, and that's completely disastrous. That needs to be something that off the back of Grenfell you see is completely dangerous.
So a desktop study, to clarify, is the idea that you work out on a computer whether the material you're using is flammable or not,
based on two separate. So rather than, because the idea is that, look, this is such a complex process, and it entails so many different components from so many different companies. There's no way that we can test every single one of these together. But if you're talking about keeping people safe and keeping people alive, it is worth it.
It's also not hard. On Sky News, I think, quite
an amazing
contemporary to the Grenfell disaster. Just afterwards, they did a experiment on some cladding which had been found not flammable by the desktop study, and they sort of said, let's try this in a laboratory, and they did it on one side. So when if you can imagine, it's horizontal, they put the fire underneath it and it resists the flame. Then they put it vertical, and because the fire goes straight into the insulation, the whole thing just goes up in about 5 seconds. And that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of laboratory experiment that they're saying it's too expensive to do. So they'll keep with the same spreadsheets, which means that they can just sort of say, oh, look, we've done the sums, it's safe.
That's right.
I mean, it's kind of, what was it? I was watching BBC Question Time last Thursday. They were obviously talking about this stuff in West London, weren't they? They were in Kensington. And you had the Tory guy there who was, what's his name, Dominic Raab, and he was saying, we don't want, a tick box culture around buildings. You think, how about, here's a box we want to tick. don't have buildings which can go up in flames really quickly. You know, we have a tick box culture for cars. Has to have a seatbelt, has to have an engine, has to have four wheels, has to have windows. I mean, this is not over the top regulation. This is just sort of the basis of running a society which makes a modicum of sense.
That's right. And the thing is with the regulations is they're performance based rather than prescriptive. So rather than saying it shouldn't contain this specific material, it says it shouldn't do this. But even in the case of limited combustibility, which is what supposedly the level for the insulation should have been, the test is that it has to burn at 750 degrees for around 2 hours and not spread too much. But the fact is that they supposedly passed the RS 5000 Celotex stuff as limited combustibility, but then Celotex coming out in January of this year saying we misdescribed the test. So clearly it wasn't limited combustibility. It would be impossible for that to have passed that test when we saw what it did to Grenfell.
It's interesting though that you highlight the sort of the use of insulation and trying to reduce carbon emissions as a variable. I hadn't thought of that, but it's true, right? You go to a new build, they're often terrible. One thing they are very good at is you don't need to use much central heating. They're really, really well insulated. And I guess this is probably one of the major overheads, is that the stuff they're using tends to be, I think more of it's probably highly flammable than we're probably told, right?
I just want to get one, if Gary saw my message, I just want to get up one image which shows you how house building has changed since the 1970s. Because obviously the argument for deregulation is that there were too many tick boxes. So there were too many tick boxes which was stopping houses getting built. But if you look at that...
Stopping innovation.
House building has declined steadily since 1970, when sort of all that, well, actually the deregulation began in 1980, but it's declined sharply since 1980 as well.
It's almost like they're full of absolute shit. It's almost like there's no relationship between increased productivity, innovation, and regulation.
And getting rid of tick boxes.
Well, and also, like Aaron makes the point, it's only 2% of the country that's used for building. More of the country is used for golf courses than building houses.
Yeah.
You know? And 1% is used for building houses.
Yeah.
Why is it we have so many people homeless? Why is it we have so many people without places to stay? Have vacant properties. It's terrible.
Should we move on to Palestine?
Let's do it.
Lowkey, you're a patron of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign.
Yeah.
You've travelled multiple times to the West Bank and Gaza.
Yeah.
Been stopped by the Israeli border guards a few times, right?
As have many people.
Yeah. Last week, there was an intensification of Israeli violence as 60 protesters were killed in a demonstration calling for the right to return for Palestinian refugees and an end to the blockade of Gaza.
Yeah.
This was obviously... this demonstration was particularly big because it was the day when Donald Trump had moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, which both the Palestinians and Israel claim to be their capital. I want to start by asking you, that level of violence we saw last Monday, sort of the disproportionality of it, and the extent to which it seemed totally unnecessary as well. Israel weren't under any threat as far as I can see. Did that surprise you?
No, because Israel has formed, after the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948, Ben Gurion at the time, now largely lauded and held up as this kind of paragon of a better way for Zionism. He essentially put it that we should shoot infiltrators. So Palestinians that were trying to return to their homes, which was their right under UN Resolution 194, were to be shot. And so this is really a continuation of that. The only contact that Palestinians in Gaza have with Israelis is through this distant, impersonal violence. You not only had those snipers on the security fence, but you also have a machine gun on top of a tower there, which is controlled by an all-female battalion in the Naqab Desert. And so it's this, either that or it's drones. This is the contact that Palestinians have. They've been put on a diet, as it was put by one of Netanyahu's henchmen, by Ariel Sharon's henchmen when they began the siege.
Which has been going on for 11 years, right?
It's an attritional real form of war with so much violence around it, uninhabitable by 2020, according to the UN. The majority of the water it can't be consumed. It's a terrible, terrible situation. But the point is that this violence, while it is committed directly by the IDF, it's also British violence, and that needs to be emphasised by us. We look at the £230 million worth of arms sales from Britain to Israel over the last 2 years. We know that they included the components for sniper rifles. So, as far as we're concerned, we see Britain's hand in this. We know that there is the naval drones that are developed by Rafael, an Israeli arms company, and BAE Systems in tandem, and it's something that BAE Systems even boast about. They aid the naval blockade of Gaza as well. So Britain's hands are really deep within this, but there's also a cross interest in this, whereby you have many companies that have offices in Britain that actually sell weapons to Israel, whether they're British companies or not. You have Elbit Systems, the parent of 5 companies in Britain. You have the Watchkeeper drone project, whereby Thales UK, which is a subsidiary of a French arms company, and Elbit Systems work on a £1 billion drone project for Britain. It's the biggest drone project in Europe, and it's based on the Hermes, which Israel used in Gaza before. We look at the 2014 campaign, the Operation Protective Edge, as it was called, which included the gruesome massacre at Shuja'iyya. You had around £7 million worth of arms sold to Israel a few months before that campaign, and stamped by Vince Cable, business secretary at the time, representing his leader, Nicholas Clegg, who in 2008-2009 had called for an arms embargo in Israel. Then, within weeks of the campaign in Gaza in 2014, which cost over 2,000 people's lives, you had them sell another few £1 million worth of arms components to Israel. So this relationship is deep. This relationship is really deep.
To what extent has the election of Donald Trump changed anything?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think that there is an intensification. Of course, the moving of the embassy of Jerusalem to Jerusalem had been something that consecutive US presidents had signed that they wouldn't do. They'd said it was their policy. Congress had put it into action. Of course, Netanyahu got 37 standing ovations when he spoke at Congress. But it's something that Trump really had the gall and the brazen hatred, essentially, to actually do. And the results of that action are going to be calamitous one way or another. But the important thing to not discount in this is the agency of Palestinian civil society. Were it not for acts of disobedience, for movements of disruption, there would have been metal detectors in Al-Aqsa by now when the Israeli army tried to put them in. That was refused, and they failed in the end. There is space, while these recent protests, which, as I said, are merely Palestinians attempting to exercise their right under UN Resolution 194, the majority of the population in Gaza are refugees. This is a product of civil society organizing. And so I think that strength is something that we can't underestimate,
All right.
Why do you think the debate in this country is so politically illiterate around the facts? So, I mean, that really came home to me last week. I think most people intuitively, I'm not going to make some aspersion about, most British people are, the fair and common sense. But I think most people can see that one group of people have arms, another group of people don't. One group of people don't have a single, injury, let alone casualty. The other side has 1,000 plus potentially harmed, 50 plus people dead. And so they know it's wrong. But this was being defended by, I don't know if you saw this, Dan Hodges on BBC last week.
I didn't see it. I heard about it. What did he say?
It was incredible. It was absolutely incredible. And you're talking about, they have to defend their borders. Well, legally these aren't their borders. You're defending borders which aren't their borders from stateless persons.
They haven't even defined themselves.
Yeah, right. It's purely arbitrary. This is the state of exception stuff. This is the embodiment of it. But yeah, why is the debate? And you talk to most Brits about this, and they don't really know the facts. And it tends to be this sort of default liberal attitude, which is, well, if only both sides could get around the table. The enmity is thousands of years old. Yeah. Now, I don't believe that most people in this country, most journalists, are Zionists, whether it's liberal or radical. I think most people, like I say, are kind of illiterate generally about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Why is that?
Well, I think Britain has a really exceptional role in the formulating essentially of the Israeli army. When you look at the period of 1936, which was one of the longest strikes in recorded human history, led by Palestinian civil society. You had Montgomery and Wingate. They were two British generals that went over to Palestine and organized disparate Zionist gangs into kind of the skeleton of what would be the IDF. So you, of course, had the role of Harold Wilson in 1967 when they sold 500 Centurion tanks to Israel in order to carry out the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and so on. So Britain is implicated in Israel's violence. And so Britain's violence, so the violence of BAE Systems, is largely invisibilized and basically presented to us as either benign or sacred violence. So either the violence is benign and no one dies, it's victimless, or it's sacred, it has to happen. And so I think as an extension of British violence, Israel is often viewed in the same way. You know, in the same way we don't hear about Yemen. No one's kicking up a fuss about the fact that billions and billions of pounds of weapons have been sold to the Saudi government, who are bombing literally the poorest people in the world, with British military advisors sitting in and helping on the targeting and the reconnaissance. The media have been close to silent on that.
Yeah, I've heard people even say, "Oh, that's a conspiracy theory," and there is the occasional article, even like the Daily Mail, where they're like there's like photos of it and stuff. And you go, this isn't a conspiracy theory.
It's very sad.
It's incredible. We've got a new Navy base in Bahrain. We're clearly actively involved in the area, Yemen in particular, which I think we had more than 1 million recorded cases of cholera. Like you say, it's on a GDP per head basis, one of the poorest countries on earth.
That's another conflict that I think the Labour right. That's what John Woodcock defends.
This is shit.
It's about.
Don't say the Labour right. I mean, he's just like a one-off.
Yeah.
There's a few cranks.
But these people have become experts at sort of framing conflict in a way that can justify the mass murder of protesters, right? So in this case, it was always Israel has a right to defend its borders, and because they've called it a border wall instead of a wall built by occupying force. I'm not saying the whole of Israel is an occupying force, but this is occupied Palestine, and they've walled in Gaza. It's not a border force. They're not defending their border. It's what Norman Finkelstein. He was on The Intercept last week. It's a very good show, but he was saying, this isn't a border wall, it's a fence of an open-air prison.
It's a giant ghetto.
Yeah.
In the historic sense.
Yeah.
But also, just to take it back to the question of why the media is like this and why the public perception is like this, we have a well-established and, in fact, entrenched obfuscation industry about Britain's violence. And I think so as an extension of that takes place, definitely.
I mean, the role of...
And it absolutely cares not about international law, of course.
Which is very duplicitous when it comes to international law. It cares about international law when a geostrategic foe has committed a war crime, and it ignores it when one of their partners has.
I think this is the rupture with Trump, whereas he doesn't actually. He would never articulate the positivity of international law. You know, there's not even like a nod to it. Whereas we know that Obama was involved in extrajudicial killings of American nationals, including an 8-year-old girl. But at least there was the articulation of the norms which are meant to underpin American democracy, constitutionalism, civil rights, human rights. Trump's just like, kill them. Yeah. So there is a bit of a shift there, and I wonder if that's ever possible in the UK. I mean, I think not explicitly. I don't think it could be. I mean, we do the same things, but explicitly, I doubt that's plausible. I think Britain likes to lie to itself a hell of a lot about its role abroad.
I think that the role of Trump in Israel-Palestine is the same as the role of Trump sort of everywhere, which is he lets everyone off the hook in the way that I think Obama was quite controlling. So he would try and restrain. He'd try and be a restraining force for the Israeli government. He'd try and be a restraining force to an extent for the American army.
Well, he'd at least pay lip service. Obama would see the value in using the feel your pain language and the lip service to things like international law and whatnot. But as you said, Donald Trump, he doesn't. He's off the leash.
I mean, he doesn't even want the US in the United Nations. Yeah. There's some claims, right? That'll be a second-term project apparently, is to get them out of the UN.
On the radio today, I was also hearing that who's the new US National Security Advisor? I can't remember.
John Bolton?
They change all. John, or maybe he's. Anyway, they change all the time. I think he's the defense secretary.
He's been there a while. He's been there a few months now.
He was saying that they're going to impose really harsh sanctions on Iran to bring them to the negotiating table. It's like they were at the negotiating table for years, and then you ripped up the agreement, And now you want to put so many sanctions on them that you bring them back to the negotiating table. It doesn't make any sense
these
whatsoever.
These are literally foaming at the mouth. They're hyper neoliberals as well. It's the complete hollowing out of the state. You know, the thing they wanted to do with the U.S. embassy in Jerusalem was get Sheldon Adelson to build it, and you know, is that right? You know, is that something that can kind of be done? You know, can you have a private party basically footing the bill for the building of the U.S. embassy? I don't know.
I didn't know, but what do you mean footing the... Because
So
obviously
the
a private company would normally build the building, right?
No, but Sheldon Adelson, as far as I understood, I think I need to look into it a bit more, but Sheldon Adelson was basically going to be behind it, you know, the US
He's the
embassy.
billionaire, right? He's
Yeah,
a very
yeah.
wealthy man anyway.
One of the main backers of Trump.
Yeah, he's going to privately fund this.
Yeah.
A bit like we were talking about it earlier, this new boat, we still can't remember what it was. Gloriana. HMS Gloriana. With fucking like a rowing boat or some nonsense. I don't know. Same thing, right? This was going to be paid for by private backers. So it shows the kind of fusion of a nostalgia for the feudal state or the pre-democratic, pre-liberal state with the idea of huge accumulations and concentrations of wealth, oligarchic power. Pretty fucking terrifying.
Yeah.
I'm going back to the relation of the UK to Israel.
Yeah.
For the first time, probably ever, there's a bona fide anti-imperialist at the head of one of the UK's major parties. Jeremy Corbyn was a patron also of Palestine Solidarity Campaign. I'm not sure if he still is. I know he had to give up a few of those roles once he became leader of the opposition. Do you think that it's made any difference to the approach of the British government or the British state to conflicts abroad that there is now an anti-imperialist in a position of public significance? Do you think that's opened the debate or shifted the Overton window when it comes to interventions abroad?
I think they've felt forced to innovate new techniques of repression, or at least intensify the techniques that were existent prior to Jeremy being propelled by groundswell into that position.
Expand on that a bit. That's interesting.
Well, I think it now seems like an actual real threat to the status quo and the vested interests that are there, that Jeremy Corbyn could come in and say, look, we need to stop signing off on these exports of weapons to Israel. And so I think that they have really mobilized the campaign against him upon that basis. And again, the obfuscation industry has intensified, you know, about this kind of violence.
Yeah, I think with Corbyn, I think you're talking about the sort of more unhinged lot, where John Woodcock now will say, yeah, we should arm Saudi Arabia, whereas before it was kind of like an unspoken thing. Or Dan Hodges saying, well, yeah, what happened in Israel is just like Bloody Sunday, and actually that was legitimate. That was the innuendo of what he said. Bloody Sunday was legitimate. So, I mean, these are the people we're dealing with. In 1972, Dan Hodges would have said, this is absolutely fine. This is absolutely the appropriate use of force. I mean, they're absolute. You know, the thing in the last few weeks I've realised is that a lot of people these people on the Labour right, Dan Hodges, I knew John Woodcock was a scumbag anyway. Dan Hodges, these people, and I've seen it in the last few days with their defending this Ian McKenzie character, these outlandish, like bizarre things he was saying to Emily Thornberry, like they're really fucked up people. Like they're genuinely fucked up people. They are psychologically screwed up people. It's not that they politically disagree. You can disagree with somebody and still get on with them. There's something seriously wrong with Dan Hodges. There is something seriously wrong with Dan Hodges. And I'm not saying that for a laugh or for shares or for likes. To defend Bloody Sunday, to defend what happened on the Gaza Strip, you have to have something really fucking wrong with you. Really deeply, seriously wrong with you.
Except it's not rare, and that's the problem. Do you know what I mean? So it looks...
Really? Who else has defended Bloody Sunday?
Oh, Bloody Sunday, yeah, because I mean that's in the past, and no one feels that they need to defend it anymore. So yeah, that sort of seems personally bizarre. But in terms of open fire on Palestinians at that demonstration,
Even Andrew Neil was like, "How are you doing this?" Portillo was like, "This is like at least give it a few months." Like seriously, I think before Corbyn, it was like nobody actually had to come out and defend this shit. So it's like you now have to kind of. There's a bit more about picking a side. Whereas before, the whole regime just kind of ignored it, sold the weapons, carried on, a bit of mealy mouth words. That's it, duplicity. But now the duplicity is kind of more revealed. It's more out in the open.
and commitment to sort of the legitimacy of the actions of the Israeli government has become sort of like a sign of hard-headed realism. So it shows that sort of like you're on the realistic side of politics in the party.
What I think is quite interesting is during the Operation Cast-led Gaza campaign, you had Dave Miliband come out and say it's very probable that British components are being used in the Israeli weaponry. Now, under the International Arms Trade Treaty, Britain is obliged to consider whether the stuff it's going to be selling, the components or the arms it's selling, are going to be used for human rights violations. We know that killing unarmed people is contradicts the Fourth Geneva Convention. We know that Human Rights Watch came out after the 30th of March and said there's absolutely clear that these people were unarmed, and we've seen no evidence that people were unarmed since then in the protest. So how is it that they can justify this continued relationship?
We're coming up to an hour, so let's take some questions in the comments. Get your questions in now. Let's see, maybe there's some if I scroll up a little bit.
Or can we say very quickly, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell button next to subscribe, so you're subscribed. Sometimes we still haven't actually posted the stuff we said we'd give away. I'm sure they've emailed in. We'll send it off.
Yeah, someone needs to check info@novaramedia.com.
Yeah,
We're going to sort it out soon, guys. Also, I should say that David Waring, the brilliant David Waring, released a video, I think, yesterday on Novara about the complicity of Britain in the actions of Israel last week, sort of expanding on what you were talking about, Lowkey, so you should check that out.
Did we tweet that? I didn't see the Twitter video.
It's about 6 minutes long, so it would be on YouTube.
Oh, we need to get a clip up. Hey, guess how many? Do you know how many? I was saying this to Lowkey before. I put it on our Slack as well. How many impressions we got the week after the general election, and then during the Labour Party conference last year? Michael, how many impressions did the Novara Twitter account get?
Do I get a prize if I guess it right?
Would you know already?
Yeah.
Okay, 5.1 million. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it's good.
5.1 million. I reckon that's more than the Daily Mirror and the Sun combined during that same period. Probably the Express as well. I know. Look, most people aren't on Twitter, but for like elite decision making, influencers, politicians, activists, it's very important. Anyway, I think that merits me saying, if you want to help us be even bigger and better and trance these people even more, go to support.novaramedia.com and help us build a new media for different politics. How does that sound, Michael?
Sounds very good. I'm distracted by the questions.
Confirmed Russian bot says, I love Lowkey. Amazing.
You've got a fan.
Yeah, they said
Russian bot.
They said you made them a socialist earlier on at like 13 or something. So you're doing good work.
Amazing.
I've heard that about you as well, actually. People telling me that you really shaped their politics.
Amazing. Well, as long as the confirmed Russian bot likes me, I'm happy.
Right. What's this Tory plan to regulate social media? Should we be worried? I'm not sure exactly what story that's.
I mean, that's been going around for about 5 years, hasn't it?
We no one knows the answer to that question.
This is a good question. How real is the possibility of a snap election this autumn? Of course, this was in the Sunday Times, and because the first 24 pages, I think, were given over to the royal wedding, the possibility of another general election was on not important, minor story, page 25, page 26. I don't think it's very likely. I think a Tory leadership election is more likely, but I think we're probably going to have one or the other in the next couple of years. I mean, I've always thought we'll have a general election in 2020.
I can't see it happening, to be honest. I mean, I think maybe it's backbenchers trying to scare Theresa May. Because, I mean, I know that there's been whispers about the fact that she wants to just cling on for 5 years until the next general election. And I think maybe there are backbenchers who are saying, no, let's have a showdown sooner. So they're saying we're willing to risk some kind of rupture this autumn. It's either going to be a leadership election or it's going to be a general election. And the fact that it seems possible that there could be a motion of no confidence in the government to sort of bring about a general election is supposed to put pressure on Theresa May.
Or it could be leverage with the European Union, which is to say, if you don't give us X, Y, Z, we'll have another general election. This guy, who's very much at odds with some of the ruling orthodoxies, will come in and he will not want to accept rules around state aid, nationalisations, government interventions, National Investment Bank.
I mean, they're not going to believe that, though. They're not going to think, oh, unless we give Britain what they want.
Why is the story out there?
Theresa
Either
May.
it's true or it's not true, and in which case, if it's not true, then why is it out there, right?
I think it's Tory backbenchers trying to put pressure on May. I mean, I think if it was to put pressure on the European Union, like, that's just so obviously a bluff. Like, imagine being a European negotiator and you think, oh, we might have to deal with Corbyn because May is willing to lose an election to piss us off. Like, that's not going to happen. She'd also lose. I can't see it happening, to be honest.
Well, she can't win.
Why would you call an election to lose it?
But it's weird because the longer we leave it, the more I think Labour will win. Just because Labour has so many internal elections constantly. It's constantly improving its campaigning strategies and techniques. All parts of the party, right? Whereas the Tories, like, you know, we got this Lewisham East by-election. Do you see the candidate? This one guy had a selfie with James Cleverly. How was he elected? How was he chosen? How many people do you reckon chose him in Lewisham East? 5 people? 6 people?
There's probably only 5 members in Lewisham.
Do you know how many people were at the hustings on Saturday morning? 470 at 10 in the morning. So the Tories have big problems. And the average age of their membership, we don't know. It's somewhere in the late 50s, early 60s. Without being macabre, you know, people move on.
This is a good question. Although it's to you, Lowkey. What do you think the implications of a socialist government rising to power at the head of one of the world's global powers?
Obviously, that's a massive question. I think you know, we saw the deep state basically come out with some statements back when, I think it was 2015, when they were talking about Jeremy Corbyn leadership. They were not ruling out the idea of a coup if entrenched interests were targeted. Obviously, the Lords of Finance would act. I mean, it would be very interesting to see what would happen. But I think they would intensify the campaign. All of the corporate media, they would become even more intense, really, in their campaign.
Someone said, would the Secret Service do an Olof Palme on Corbyn? He was the Swedish Prime Minister who tried to sort of build, well, the New World Order, but presumably it wasn't called the New World Order. Right. It was the idea that sort of like you have a
Trump's like, we're going to leave the UN and we're going to call it the NWO.
Yeah, I can't remember what Olof Palme
one
called
was
it, but it
right.
was the idea that you sort of build a new multilateral system which isn't based on Western hegemony. And he got assassinated. So presumably this guy's theory is that it was done by the Secret Service. I think potentially no one was ever found for the assassination. But do you think the challenge of a Corbyn government trying to...
I think it potentially depends how serious Jeremy would be, you know.
I mean, it's a very speculative question.
About challenging the centres of power, but definitely they try and do what they can to kind of debilitate the functions of the state.
People are asking about Venezuela. Does anyone have strong opinions on Venezuela? I haven't really been following that story today. If you want to know, if you want to see some debate about Venezuela, we did 2 debates on it last year in the summertime.
I think it is something to definitely talk about, because what happens with socialism, not in one country, but socialism without a broader global revolution, and these have been conversations that have been in circulation for a century, is that they face problems. Especially when, I mean, in the Soviet Union, it was a different matter because giant country, huge energy reserves, huge agricultural reserves, mineral wealth. Country like Venezuela, it's a bit more difficult.
Well, I mean, it did have huge mineral wealth. I mean, we discussed this in depth last year, but I mean,
yeah,
I
but
think
sanctions on countries like Venezuela. I mean, even Iran can deal with sanctions because it has a massive agricultural sector. You know, it could be an autark. It can feed itself. It has got steel production. It has got petroleum and gas. So in the context of, you know, US global hegemony, a particular sort of global financial architecture where funding can just be cut off like that. I mean, struggles like Venezuela are always going to be limited without assistance from the global north. And this is where I would disagree with sort of the third worldists. They say, well, the revolutionary subject is in the global south. I think the lesson of the last sort of 50 years, 60s, 70s, 80s, is, well, to an extent they can catalyse struggles, but they need the support of people here as well. And it's vital.
I mean, it's easy to say, isn't it? But there were also mistakes made by the Venezuelan government.
I mean, there's mistakes made by all governments.
But I mean, I think it's a useful case study to sort of see, one, what happens when, you try socialism in one country in a very hostile global environment, but also what can happen when you give sort of like agents of the state particular powers over the economy and how it can fuck up. I'm a bit of a reformist. So I do think there are sort of like lessons to learn about socialism from looking at sort of how the economy's got completely fucked up over the last 2 years with quite high human costs, to be honest.
Is this 11 kilos stat true?
I don't know. To be honest, I haven't done enough research to answer
true.
this question right now. But
it's also like, well, okay, life expectancy of the average Russian male with the dissolution of the Soviet Union collapsed by like 5 years during the 1990s. Nobody's blaming capitalism for that, are they? I mean, we do. But, I mean, you can point to sort of catastrophic outcomes under a variety of economic systems anyway.
All right, let's...
Have you got any thoughts on Jordan Peterson, Lowkey?
Big question. I think I find his conclusions to be quite nihilistic and fatalistic in a way. And what it does is it's really putting men into a position where they can justify the existing social relations that they have and the advantages that they have within the society by calling upon somehow this is in touch with natural order. So throughout history, it seems that when we've seen unjust relations, there's always been someone somewhere arguing that, well, no, that this is actually human nature and this is actually how it should be. You know, whether it's Richard Dawkins saying the selfish gene is inherent in human beings, or whether it's Adam Smith saying people are naturally self-interested. I feel, to be honest, that a lot of, you know, the superficial impression that I have of Jordan Peterson's stuff, I haven't read any of his books. I've watched one or two. Well, I've watched about 3 or 4 of his lectures online. I feel like it's kind of erring towards that way, where you're basically saying, well, this is natural. You know, society should be arranged this way. And I think anything that's basically coming out and saying that the status quo is normal and the status quo is natural, we should be suspicious of.
Do you think he because clearly he's been very successful, do you think the fact that he's trying to resonate at a certain emotional, personal level, and he seems to do it in a way, I think he's a complete fraud, by the way, but the ambition to do that, the ambition to reach people in that particular point in their psyche is something that in my estimation the left fails to do. Either it's very technocratic, it points to numbers, or it points to sort of marginal social improvements which people don't really care about, not very personally invested in. And it's a weird synthesis of like self-help, self-improvement. Clearly it's a massive genre for a reason. Obviously serves some kind of psychological need, meets some sort of psychological need. And it feels to me, if you talk about this in politics, we have a massive mental health crisis in this country and elsewhere, that people sort of laugh at you. But I think there's clearly a genre of literature we need to take seriously, if not for the content, for the fact that it's incredibly popular. And it's clearly a gap in our society, I feel. Let's talk about its absence of metaphysical value, so to speak. What are your thoughts there?
No, I think he's definitely been successful at intellectualizing a lot of people's psychological, emotional problems, explaining them away, giving them kind of ready-made answers to saying, look, responsibility, that's the reason you're depressed, is you don't have responsibility and you naturally want and need and thrive when given responsibility. And so it kind of feeds into individualism at the same time, that it feeds into kind of this, like I say, the preservation of relations and social relations. And so I think it's not good.
Michael?
We've discussed Jordan Peterson on Tiski's.
It's a great show.
Yeah.
We should, if Gary hasn't posted the link already, he should. It's a great show. I'm sure he has.
One more interesting question. I've lost it now, but I'm going to I'll just summarize what the general theme was. So the theme was, did seeing sort of like the self-organization in the community in Kensington after Grenfell change your attitudes on anarchism? I'm not sure if you've had previously published positions on anarchism, but...
No, I wouldn't say that I have I wouldn't. That's a good question. I think that needs some thought. I think I'd have to go away and think about that before I come back and give a comprehensive answer to that.
Interesting. All right.
Can I just say, actually, before we go, I remember being at the first march around Grenfell, and you could sense the anger and the hostility. You were there as well. I mean, we all were there, I'm sure, but I was with you. And I was just shocked that there wasn't a riot. I mean, it would have been like... Not as in like they would have had their right. I mean, I would have expected it because, you know, so much anger there, so many young men in particular.
And also the violence that we'd seen, you know, it was violent.
Yeah.
What had happened.
Yeah. And I think there's something to think about there, you know?
No, I agree. I mean, actually,
people talk about young people being so violent, stabbing each other, etc., but actually I think it was remarkably peaceful.
What to relate it back to Gaza, what Norman Finkelstein, very different situation, but what Norman Finkelstein was saying about Hamas and those protests at it's not a border wall, but at the Israeli the security fence, that's a better word for it, was that it's being painted by the international media as sort of like a violent protest. And he said that actually Hamas, he said he's not a fan of Hamas or their ideology, but he said they've actually shown remarkable self-restraint because they know that life is most difficult for the Israeli government if they stay peaceful. So it's sort of like on record as, I can't remember who it was who said this, but an Israeli government minister sort of saying, we're not very good at doing Gandhi. So when they have non-violent resistance to the state of Israel, because obviously when it comes to physical violence, they can completely dominate any kind of opposition. But sort of that self-restraint by a group of people who have had sort of like terrible crimes basically done against them, which was the same in Grenfell, it's the same in Gaza, that these people have a real reason to erupt in violence, and sort of the self-restraint that you have to show to not do that is quite incredible.
Yeah, I was never a believer in that, but I think the older I get, maybe I'm becoming a bit more reactionary. I think it works in a sense. Not that you should have to do it, but I used to be a bit more confrontational. But I think,
but one doesn't necessarily negate the other.
No, of course not.
They could encompass, both kind of both things, both principles.
But I thought the whole peaceful thing was kind of like, how can I put this? Pious, unnecessary. But I think there is a certain, we'll see. But there is a sense that after the last couple of weeks in Israel, I think something's going to shift in Israel, in the Israel-Palestine conflict one way or another.
I do think
it's not Taliban anymore.
I do think there is space when you look at the fact that you have at least 20% of Israel's population are Palestinians. So there is, I think, a potential for pressure to be applied to certain levers of power within the state that can in some ways debilitate and interrupt the movement of the gross military power of the IDF. And I do think that, the Palestinian struggle does have precedent in that regard in terms of the methods of kind of disruptive civil disobedience. But I do think it has to be a component of a wider struggle encompassing many different forms of resistance, whether it's cultural, musical, and of course the Palestinian people as occupied people do have the right under international law to armed resistance as well. We can't forget that.
That is an important point.
Yeah.
A lot of people have asked about what we think about Ken Livingstone leaving the Labour Party. I think it's good that he resigned. I think he had a very impressive political career up to about 2 years ago, when he just couldn't stop talking about Nazis on the television, which was very unhelpful to
and this is why they
everyone.
This is why they were getting him on the television. They were getting him on the television because it would help discredit the left and discredit Corbyn. That was why, and he knew that. I presume he knew that was why it was happening. He still kept on doing it. This is what I call, Umanism. You talk to the nearest TV camera. It's the whole raison d'etre of Chaka Umana. Not good.
All right, should we wrap up?
Yeah.
Yeah. Any final thoughts?
Thank you for having me, and the struggle continues.
Yeah. Pleasure to have you on. Lovely to have you back, Aaron.
When are you going on BBC Question Time?
I don't know.
Yeah, you'd be really
they had
good
a
on
car
Question Time.
next is Lowkey.
I don't know. We'll see.
I think you'd be like a shock to the system. They'd be like, fuck. Be good.
Thank you.
For BBC producers watching,
No, they should have you on, man.
I've already been banned once.
Right. In what circumstances? Why?
It was a clever hatchet job by Guido. So the day I was meant to go on,
Right.
they put out a few years ago. I smashed up a bank. Went to court, criminal damage, yada yada yada. 100 hours, 150 hours probation.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Community service.
Community service.
And so that disqualifies you from being.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
They have murderers on there all the time.
That's true. I mean, they've had Jeffrey Archer in there. He's been in Nick. So I mean, quite right. I mean, people rehabilitate and all sorts. I mean, I didn't quite see the rationale, but yeah. I mean, it'd be great to go on. I think you'd be great on there.
I think either of you would be good.
Gary's telling me to big up the Akala interview we've got dropping this week,
Yeah,
which is very exciting.
Get his book, Natives.
You were reading his book as you arrived.
I am. Yeah.
All right, we're going to wrap up. This was Tisky Sour. I'm Michael Walker. This is Lowkey. This is Aaron. And we've all been... It's been a pleasure to be joined by you.
Smashed up a bank, respect.
Yeah.
I don't recommend it.
See you next week.